Donald, can I turn to you to share some reflections?
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I'm going to talk about two programs in Africa, the one that became the other. And I'm going to talk about that story and that progress. The first of these is the APOC program, the African Program for Onchocerciasis Control. I'm sorry about the acronyms and the long names, which I led when I was at the World Bank, based here in DC for 15 years. And then the next one is ESPEN, the Expanded Special Program for the Elimination of Neglected Tropical Diseases, not ESPN, ESPEN, which took over from APOC and which I helped launch when I was at the Gates Foundation. So these are programs that are massive and extremely well known and Africa-based. So these are programs that you don't know if you don't work in Africa. These are exceptional programs from that point of view. 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, hugely variant, countries that vary from $600 per capita to $60,000 per capita in terms of income, 600 million people at risk. And the disease that this all started with was river blindness or onchocerciasis, a blinding disease. We've all seen the pictures of children leading their parents because their parents are blind. We've seen the empty villages that caused. And in 1974, a program was started that was designed, really the first of those big regional programs, to try and eliminate the problem caused by that disease. Program working in 11 countries. By the end of it, it had spent about $1 billion on larviciding, killing the vectors that spread this disease, and had a massive impact. Something like 18 million children were no longer at risk. The villages became repopulated. The farmland became available to feed 18 million people. But it was incredibly expensive. And during that phase, there was a major advance at Merck. And they developed a drug called ivermectin, which is still a big seller in the veterinary market, a remarkable product. And in the 70s, they also worked out that it was a drug that would do something about river blindness, the only one that was available. And famously, in 1987, Roy Vagelos, previously the research lead, then the CEO, stood up and said that they would provide this drug, they would provide as much as was necessary for as long as was necessary. And he famously tells us that he said that without asking his board first. But 40 years later, that's still true. In fact, Merck's delivery on that has increased rather than declined. So once that drug became, and perhaps I should also mention, there's a Nobel Prize in the discovery of ivermectin and the great good it did. But the great good it did wasn't just in dealing with river blindness, but it was also in blazing a trail that others have now followed. Because what happened was that the early program of larviciding was converted into a program of mass drug distribution. It was called the African Program for Onchocerciasis Control. 20 countries, World Health Organization led, World Bank funding, 45 donors, 15 non-state partners, all pushing forward to eliminate this disease as a public health program. And when they were doing that, the success of that program attracted in other big pharma interests. Johnson & Johnson and GlaxoSmithKline were amongst the early adopters there. But by 2012, 14 big pharma companies got together and made what was called the London Declaration, saying that they would pledge to provide drugs through to 2020 to address the worst of the neglected tropical diseases, and that they would together provide 1.5 billion doses a year, a donation worth about $17.5 billion. A huge donation. Now, APOC, as I said, focused on onchocerciasis specifically, not on all of these diseases. But APOC was scheduled to end in 2015 and did end in 2015, and that had set people thinking about what next. And the what next was to say, why don't the countries now get together and deliver on the promise of the 2012 London Declaration? So not now just one disease, but at least 5 principal, very important diseases throughout Africa, targeting now 44 countries. And the 44 ministers of health came forward and said, yes, that's what we want, and we want this to be based in WHO Africa, in the World Health Organization's African Regional Office in Brazzaville, in the Congo. And so, in 2016, ESPEN was launched, dealing with all of these diseases, mass treatment programs, led by WHO. And what I wanted to reflect on was how all of this functioned in practice. That's where I want to get to. So that story really is to set the context for what I'm about to say. So we're talking now about an organization based in Africa, led out of Africa, with 44 governments overseeing the process, also with some 14 donors involved, also with non-state partners involved. And I want to just reflect on the 4 sectors that played a role. That would be the private sector, the multilateral development partners, the bilateral and non-state development partners, and the countries themselves. So let's start with the private sector. Remember, there were 14 big pharma involved in this. The challenges were remarkable. I was quite interested in watching the drones taking off here, because we're talking about delivering 600 million doses. Something I had never realized, because of the scale that's involved, it actually matters the size of the dose. So if you've got a few milligrams, a pill that's got a few milligrams of active ingredient, you can send those by air. If you've got a 1 gram pill, there's plenty of those around, and sometimes you need 2 for a dose, then you better start shipping on ships, because you're talking about tons of pharmaceuticals that you've got to move around. And so there was this very interesting process, very interesting challenge, that these were different weights, different ways of delivering them through different mechanisms. And then the other challenge was, some of these drugs only do one thing. They treat a particular, perhaps obscure disease. Whereas others, sometimes like in trachoma, you're using a very popular antibiotic as the main treatment. That's fungible, i.e. you can sell that. That's a product that leakage is a real challenge. And so there are big differences in how you deal with those issues. And then, of course, there's ivermectin itself, which I don't like to say this for having Brenda Colatrella in the room, but you can use this to treat most things. People do, right? So, we get countries saying, well, we've got rid of onchocerciasis, but we've still got plenty of scabies, so we're going to carry on with the donation. Merck has to decide whether they want to do that or not. And so there are big problems. There are all these challenges, and to address those challenges, you actually have to have joined up working at all stages in the process. WHO came in as dealing with the demand for the system, so they would arbitrage in the demand. They created also a network-wide, a region-wide data management system, so they knew what was going and where and how. And then we had things like the CEO roundtable that we discussed yesterday as part of the overall coordination of that. Remarkably, that works. That works well. Private sector. Multilateral development partners. Particularly here, we're talking about World Bank and WHO. And there are all kinds of issues here about oligarchies and bureaucracy and so on. But what we also have with those groups is that they're answerable to the member governments, and that the annual meetings where the ministers come are the ones which determine the direction of the whole program. So there's an interesting set of issues in that. The creation of one technical hub for the whole of Africa, for all of those 48 countries, is a masterstroke. It means that you don't have to replicate all those technical expertise throughout all of the countries, and that has changed the way in which the practice has happened. Then you have the bilaterals and the non-state development partners, and there we have a problem, and some of these will be things we want to talk about. There you have a problem of perverse incentives. You've got the potential here to leverage power with this massive donation, something like $4.5 billion worth of products a year. That's something to compete for. You have also power you can leverage with branding. Being part of this means you can conjure up more resources for your organization. And so there is a number of issues that came out with that. And then in the countries themselves, the Ministry of Health and the Revenue and Customs departments of the same governments often didn't talk to each other. So it was a very common situation that the drugs would be delivered to the country, and then there was an expectation that duty would be paid on the free donations. And that sounds easy to solve, but it certainly wasn't. And the solution turned out to be the companies, the pharmaceutical companies, all getting together and agreeing that their endpoint was what they say the first mile. So they didn't deliver to the ports or the airports, they delivered to the pharmacy. So in other words, they took on the responsibility of going through the customs and dealing with all of those issues. A remarkable thing. Nevertheless, the supply chain challenges in the country, and Jim's given us some great illustrations of those, remained, and those remain a challenge in some countries. And finally, my final point here is the confusion between the concept that these donations are free and that these donations are worthless. People need to value, of course, the product they get, even though they're not paying for it. And that's not a straightforward thing. One of the first roles that ESPEN paid, and it's well documented, is that from 7 countries, they recovered 132 million tablets that were sitting on shelves and would have sat until they went off, until they exceeded their the expiry dates. Because it was much simpler to keep sending pills to the hospitals than it was to track what had gone out and to ensure that things were returned that weren't used. So what am I saying here? Hugely complex set of issues, really successful programs providing healthcare to people who don't get healthcare. This is absolutely beyond the end of the road healthcare that we're talking about. The challenges turn out not to be among the private sector, which is kind of what I was hearing a lot of yesterday. The challenges are very much around coordination among the development partners and also the low capacity in the countries themselves, in the poorest countries themselves. So I think very interesting story, hugely successful, but also a bit of a secret because it's not on the international stage.
Terrific. Thank you, Donald. And absolutely fascinating going through that journey from APOC through to ESPEN and how some of the challenges and hurdles you hit there. And we'll dig into that in the questions.